Chapter 23. Hitler is undoubtedly a great man. 10 thrilling days. Charles and Anne took off from Penshurst airfield in a borrowed monoplane, leaving John behind with his nurse. The Kent police had promised to keep an eye on their house. As they circled over Longbarn, John ran out onto the green grass, waving at a large towel and doing a little dance. His parents waved back. Then they flew over the English Channel, following maps and landmarks until they landed in Berlin 4 hours later. A row of officials from the Air Ministry greeted them with a click of their heels and a thrust of their right arms. "Hail Hitler!" An officer stepped forward, handing a bouquet of red roses to Anne. He relayed greetings from General Hermann Göring. Then he briskly escorted Charles to an open car. Charles and Major Smith climbed in beside the officer. Anne found herself in the back seat of a second closed car with K. Smith. It was, of course, ridiculous to think the Nazi propaganda machine would abide by Charles's request not to publicize his visit. The publicity value of the famous aviator's visit was the whole point, and so Berlin gave him an official welcome as he drove into the city. Unlike those at similar events in other cities, however, these crowds were controlled. There was no pushing or shoving, no one breaking through barriers and running up to the hero's car. They were adoring yet polite. Charles responded with a surprised, shyly pleased smile. He nodded at the people. He even waved occasionally. He almost seemed to be enjoying himself. Behind him in the second car, Anne gazed out the window and marveled at the neatness, order, trimness, cleanliness of the streets. There was no sense of poverty. Berlin looked untouched by the Depression. Filled with cars and bicycles, the city's boulevards felt alive with optimism. Everyone looked healthy and well-dressed. She was especially delighted by the city's sense of festivity. Flags hung out. The Nazi flag, red with a swastika on it everywhere. Neither she nor Charles realized that in order to put its best face to the world, Berlin had been cleaned up. Under Hitler's orders, the omnipresent "Jews not welcome" signs had been removed from hotels, restaurants, and other public places. Nazi police were warned not to take any action against Jews and to be unfailingly courteous to everyone, even the virulent anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer had temporarily ceased publication. Additionally, all undesirable persons, including 800 members of the Sinti and Roma tribes, had been rounded up off the streets and interned in a special detention camp 18 miles outside the city. The goal, recalled one Nazi official, was to give Berlin the appearance of a perfectly normal place in which life went on as pleasantly as in any other European country. The Lindberghs stayed with the Smiths at their apartment. Major Smith marveled at Charles's knowledge of mechanics, while Kay admired his vitality and confidence. Neither, however, was impressed by his knowledge of history or government. He was, admitted Kay, a naive political thinker, and when it came to understanding post-World War I Europe, his mind was an empty void. Both Smiths warned him not to be taken by Berlin's facade, but Kay doubted Charles would be able to separate Nazi propaganda from the truth. The Lindberghs spent much of this visit apart. Charles's days were filled with drives to various aeronautical sites. One morning he flew 2 German planes, the Junkers Ju-52, the centerpiece of the Luftwaffe's new bomber force, and an experimental plane that had 4 of the biggest engines Charles had ever seen. Afterward, he visited a Junkers factory, where he saw engines far more sophisticated than he'd expected. Another day, he went to 2 Heinkel factories, where he saw their latest bombers, fighters, and observation planes, all, he concluded, superior to anything but being built in the United States. Another visit took him to a research facility where he talked with scientists about their technological advances. He even got to meet pilots from the Luftwaffe's elite fighter squadron. Why were the Nazis so eager to share their secrets? Neither Charles nor Major Smith seems to have asked this question. By the end of his time in Germany, Charles's respect for German aircraft was matched only by his awe at their national pride and discipline. There was, he wrote, a spirit in Germany which I have not seen in any country. There is a great ability, and I am inclined to think more intelligent leadership than is generally recognized. A person would have to be blind not to realize that they have already built up tremendous strength. While Charles shuttled from factory to airfield, Anne marveled at how Hitler's government kept the press at bay. In Berlin, she was left alone to shop and dine and stroll through parks and museums as she pleased. Perhaps she'd been wrong to believe that dictatorships are of necessity wrong, evil, unstable, and no good can come of them, she admitted. After all, she concluded, there is no question of the power, unity, and purposefulness of Germany. Charles was rethinking his opinion of dictatorships too. Despite how newspapers in England and America depicted Hitler, he knew what he saw. The organized vitality of Germany was what impressed me, he wrote. The unceasing activity of the people, and the convinced dictatorial direction to create the new factories, airfields, and research laboratories. To him, the country concretized his values, science and technology harnessed for the preservation of a superior race. Charles was beginning to think that the strong moral world order, strong central leadership of the Nazi state was the only hope for restoring a moral world order, no matter that it came at the cost of democratic institutions, individual liberties, and a free press. All that freedom, Charles believed, just led to irresponsibility and moral decay. But here in Germany, Hitler had restored moral order to Western civilization. Wasn't this exactly what he and Dr. Carroll had always talked about? On August 1st, 1936, 100,000 people streamed into the newly built Olympic Stadium for opening day. As one, they raised their arms and hailed the Führer. A few seats away from Hitler, Charles Lindbergh sat ramrod straight, while next to him Anne enthusiastically applauded the spectacle of it all, the band playing Deutschland über alles, the blonde-haired little girls offering bouquets of roses to the dictator, the lighting of the Olympic torch, and the release of 5,000 pigeons. Time and again Anne touched her husband's arm and exclaimed, "Look, Charles, look!" Leaving the stadium later that day, Charles told reporters that he was intensely pleased by all he'd seen while in Germany. Also present at opening day, American reporter William Scherer overheard people in Nazi circles boast about their success in making Lindbergh understand Nazi Germany. Upon leaving Germany, Anne wrote that she'd found her 10 days there thrilling. Hitler is a very great man, like an inspired religious leader, not scheming, not selfish, not greedy for power. She gushed, but a visionary who really wants the best for his country. Charles was also impressed. Hitler is undoubtedly a great man, he said, and I believe he has done much for Germany. The British and Americans, Charles believed, had a very distorted and incomplete picture of the Nazis. Hitler's government would be a stabilizing factor in Europe. Charles wondered, was a democracy truly superior to a dictatorship? Modern Germany challenged that notion. So had Dr. Carroll when he talked of rule by elites and his higher council. Now Charles's experiences and ideologies coalesced. New ideas emerged with clarity. Are we deluding ourselves when we attempt to run our governments by counting the number of heads, without a thought of what lies within them? He asked himself. It now seemed to him that democracy, which allowed everyone, even those obviously unfit, an equal say in national decisions, would soon become obsolete. The future, the only hope for restoring a moral world, lay in the hands of a strong, smart dictator like Hitler. New eyes. Back in England, Charles found the country suddenly exasperating. Having witnessed Nazi virility and efficiency, he felt that the British people's softness and stupidity were obvious in comparison. England saw not the future but the past, he testily wrote in his journal. Months earlier he'd had a plane designed and built especially for him, a Miles M12 Mohawk. With its powerful engine, the lightweight, low-winged aircraft could fly an impressive 1,400 miles without refueling at a top speed of 200 miles per hour. Charles once more had wings, and he took to the air in part to escape his irritation. In November, he flew alone to Ireland, where he inspected a new airport. And in February 1937, he and Anne headed off on an 8-week trip to India, still a British colony, where he swore he could see the early symptoms of the breakup of the British Empire. As they flew along the coast of Greece, Charles looked down on the ancient ruins and saw a metaphor for modern Europe. The Greek city-states were in constant disagreement, and the extraordinary civilization they had developed gave way to chaos and destruction. He worried this would happen to European civilization if another war on the continent ever erupted. Fighting with itself, Europe would self-destruct. And what would be left behind? But it was the sights, sounds, and smells of India with its ragged, hungry people, filthy streets, and scabby, thin-legged children that confirmed for him one of Dr. Carroll's core beliefs, that real civilization meant white civilization. In India, human life had sunk to levels he'd never seen before. How had this country once produced a civilization of art and architecture and religion? Charles grew alarmed. What if modern Western civilization destroyed itself through war or politics? Perhaps he should move his family to some distant white men's frontiers like Australia or New Zealand. The future of the white race, which had once seemed secure beyond the need of questioning, was now in peril. We whites were so accustomed to dominating that it was difficult to realize that we were a minority in a world of yellow, brown, and black. Charles felt as if his eyes were being opened. A second English spring. Another spring at Long Barn. It was good to be back with John. Good to see Anne working on her book again. Good to be in his lab. But this second April in Kent was not as idyllic as the first. Charles could not stop dwelling on Germany's magnificent spirit. It was as if his unhappiness with England was growing in direct proportion to his admiration for the Third Reich. The English Spring did bring one joyous event. On May 12th, 1937, Anne gave birth to their third child, a boy with blue eyes and Grandma Morris nose, just like the others. Not until the day before Anne's and little Charlie's birthday did they finally register the baby's name, Morrow Lindbergh, after Charles's maternal grandfather. As we couldn't agree on any first names. We have taken a last one," Anne wrote her mother. The next morning, June 22nd, when I was thinking of all my other birthdays, sitting on my bed, remembering little Charles, the new baby gave me the most beautiful, real smile, a real one that fills his whole face, and the blue eyes trying to talk to. I was so happy to have on this birthday my two little boys. Days in Munich. Anne and Charles flew through log a thick London fog before heading south across the English Channel to France. Soaring above hilltop castles and the spires of cathedrals, they followed a tributary of the Rhine River until they finally landed in Munich. It was October 1937, and Charles had gotten the wish he'd repeatedly expressed in letters to Major Smith. The Air Ministry had invited him to return to Germany. They said they wanted to show him some places no one outside the Luftwaffe had seen yet. While Anne rambled through Bavarian villages, Charles went on a unique round of sightseeing. With German General Ernst Udet as his escort, Goring requested that Smith remain behind. He visited a secret aircraft installation in Pomerania. There he examined the 7 airplanes lined up on the airstrip for inspection, including Junkers and Messerschmitts. Udet allowed his guest to sit in the plane's cockpits and even let him test another new model, the Fiesler F5 156. Storch Liaison plane. They did not, however, go inside any of the dozens of gigantic hangars. That day, Charles left the airstrip firmly believing that Germany was once more a world power in the air. A sentence he included in a 4-page memoir, and he collaborated on with Major Smith. The memorandum was eventually sent to the United States War Department and not only detailed all Charles had seen, but also estimated the strength of the entire Luftwaffe. Charles was convinced that strength was awesome, easily outstripping the French and British air forces, and quickly closing in on the United States. It was exactly what Goering wanted him to report. Since Charles's first visit to Germany, his amiable Nazi hosts had been feeding him inflated numbers and exaggerated readiness reports. His naivete about Nazi propaganda made him easy to fool, claimed one Luftwaffe official. Lindbergh's willing self-deception simply refused to see what his eyes saw, admitted Lieutenant General Heinz J. Rieckhoff years later. Instead, Lindbergh insisted on assuming that there was still more hidden behind it. He had no way of knowing that the hangars he was being shown were completely or filled with ancient dust-discovered aircraft. Dust-covered aircraft. Charles's second stay in Nazi Germany also confirmed his earlier personal impressions. Any fanaticism he glimpsed was offset by the Germans' sense of decency and value, which in many ways is far ahead of our own. And this second visit deepened his annoyance with the British. He even found their constant tea drinking irritating. The whole idea seems a little effeminate to me, he said, during dinner with his friend and landlord, Harold Nicholson. The following spring, Charles prattled on about the German Air Force. It is 10 times superior to that of Russia, France, and Great Britain put together, he said. Your British defenses are futile. You should just make an alliance with Germany. Nicholson never invited the Lindberghs to his home again. Not that they cared. They had already decided to abandon crumbling, backward England and move to a tiny, windswept island off the coast of Brittany, taken up almost entirely by a weather-battered 3-story stone house lacking heat, electricity, or plumbing. Ilicus the island was called as the Iliac, as the island was called, was scenic, private, and, best of all, just a 10-minute rowboat ride from Dr. Carroll's summer home on the nearby island of St. Gildas. Charles purchased the plain site unseen in March 1938, choosing not to wait until renovations on the rundown house were completed. He wanted to leave England as soon as possible. Anschluss. For months, the Nazi Party in Austria, funded by and taking directions from Berlin, had been stirring up trouble, rioting, setting fire to buildings, brawling in the streets. Then, on March 11th, 1938, Nazi tanks and armored cars rolled across the border of Germany shared with that country. That same day, the Austrian government had appointed a Nazi politician, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, as chancellor in hopes of appeasing the party and putting an end to the violence. As soon as he was sworn in, however, Seyss-Inquart, following Hitler's orders, cabled Berlin and begged for Germany's help in restoring order. It was a ruse, of course, an excuse for a German invasion of Austria. The troops arrived in Vienna the next morning. No one tried to stop them. Instead, the majority of Austrians, 7 million of whom were ethnic Germans, welcomed them as heroes. 24 hours later, on March 13th, Chancellor Seyss-Inquart signed the document that would end Austrian independence, called Anschluss, meaning union. It allowed the Third Reich to annex the entire country. It was the first step in Hitler's grand scheme to unite all German-speaking people, and he'd done it without firing a single shot. British and French leaders barely whimpered when they heard the news. France, its own politics in turmoil, was in no position to oppose the annexation. While Britain did not have the political will, besides, Anschluss didn't appear to threaten their security. And since Austria and Germany spoke the same language, why shouldn't they unify? Few people, including Charles, seemed to realize that with Anschluss, Hitler had added 7 million people and an army of 100,000 to the Reich. He'd seized important resources like steel and iron ore. He'd tipped the balance of power in southeastern Europe in Germany's favor, and Schleck and Six Sick and and Czechoslovakia was bordered on three sides by the Nazis. Last days at Long Barn. The gardens at Long Barn seemed to bloom before Anne's eyes. The red roses on the trellises, the lilac bushes, the wrinkling pink poppies. She wished she had time to soak it all in, to impress the place on her memory, but she was too busy. Their last days in England had been crowded with closing accounts, shopping for supplies to send to the island, and packing, endlessly packing. Charles packed in a methodical and tedious manner. Before being wrapped and put in a box, every single item, every article of clothing, every book, every package of rubber bands, every packet of tinsel for the Christmas tree had to be listed. Then the list was typed and glued to the inner lid of the box before it was sealed. Today, though, the Lindberghs put aside their work for a few hours. It was May 12th, Land's first birthday, and while John sang at the top of his lungs, Anne settled the 1-year-old on her lap. The baby made a grab for his cake. It was decorated with a single candle and silver candles that spelled out his name. Anne pulled back his plump hand. Land cried, and Charles, making silly noises in the hope of getting his son to smile, snapped his picture. Later, after the cake had been eaten and Land had opened his present, a toy duck, the nurse took both boys upstairs for baths and bed, and Charles and Anne walked in the garden as the light faded. Anne ached with sadness at the thought of leaving. She knew her husband had no sentimental attachment to Long Barn, but she loved it as if it were mine, a part of me. She confessed in her diary, I feel dimly that I shall look back on this period as the happiest in my life, the 2 years in this house. After the Anschluss, in May 1938, while the Lindberghs were still packing, Adolf Hitler was sizing up Czechoslovakia with all its valuable raw materials. He considered invading, but if he did, France, obligated by treaty, might come to the Czechs' aid. So, too, would Britain, which was treaty-bound to France. Hitler doubted France or Britain, who'd barely said a word about Anschluss, would fight. But why take the chance? So he settled on a different course of action and set his sights on the Sudetenland. Before World War I, this small section of western Czechoslovakia had belonged to Germany, but under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the territory had been given to Czechoslovakia. A majority of the Sudetenland's inhabitants remained ethnic Germans, and many of them genuinely wanted to return to German rule. Using their desire as pretext, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland be handed over to him. He expected the Czechs, like the Austrians, to fold quickly, but the Czech government dug in its heels. It appealed to France and Britain for help. As the weather warmed, tensions heated up. While French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier and British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain desperately searched for ways to avoid a fight with Germany, Hitler grew angrier and more strident, and the Czechs grew even more stubborn. By June, it had become a war of nerves, with Nazi groups in the Sudetenland under Hitler's direction staging violent demonstrations and launching terrorist attacks. By July, armies all over Europe were put on a war footing, and by August, things looked so bad that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt cabled a personal message to the leaders of Czechoslovakia, Britain, France, and Germany. He urged the four countries to find a peaceful solution. Additionally, and privately, he told France and Britain that America could not help if they chose to go to war. Both Daladier and Chamberlain assured the president of their commitment to reason rather than armed conflict. Hitler, however, insisted that if the Sudetenland was not handed over, he would resort to force.